Hi, Gary Zacharias again with the Apologist bookshelf. I've got another book by John Lennox that I wanted to share right now. Lennox wrote 2084. I've already referred to that in the past in another podcast, but just to give you an idea, Lennox is a professor of math at the University of Oxford. Just an amazing guy. He's written God's Undertaker. Subtitle has Science Buried God. Looks at science and theology at lectures. He's got some wonderful YouTube videos where he clashes kindly with people who disagree with him. He's just a wonderful speaker. Seems like a kind of guy you'd love to have around the house just to sit down and talk to him. So this is a book called 7 Days That Divide the World. Subtitle, The Beginning According to Genesis and Science. So he's going to take on an issue that creates a firestorm among Christians about creation. When did it happen? How should we read Genesis? In fact, the book cover says, what did the writer of Genesis mean by the first day? Are the 7 days a literal week or a series of time periods? If I believe the earth is 4.5 billion years old, am I denying the authority of Scripture? So these are tough things that Christians wrestle with. But people have appreciated this book. They've commented on it. What I like about it is it's not overwhelming. It's less than 200 pages, and he has all sorts of wonderful footnotes that let you know where he got his information. I'd like to cover Chapter 3. Maybe I should tell you first the kinds of topics that he covers in here. So here's his table of contents. He says a lesson from history, and then a lesson about Scripture, and then how old is the earth? Human beings, are they a special creation? And then he has some appendices. One of them I like especially. It's about theistic evolution. And so anyway, I wanted to do Chapter 3, and it's subtitled, But Is It Old? The Days of Creation. And he says, if you think about it, there are people who believe that the days of Genesis are 24-hour days of one earth week, which of course makes the universe extremely young. But he said, then you've got others who believe that the universe is ancient, probably millions of years old. And so he said both positions go back a long way. Neither one is a recent invention. So he says if you take people like Luther and Calvin, they held to the 24-hour view. But he said even others interpreted it differently. Philo is a Jewish author, and some of the early church fathers like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, they mentioned 2 Peter 3:8, where it says, with the Lord 1 day is 1,000 years, 1,000 years is 1 day. So there are people who have kind of lined up on both sides of it. So I'm going to skip over this part of that. He says, it's important to know that people that understood Genesis as 24-hour days probably they represented the dominant view for many centuries. And so he says, then you've got the clash or the tension between people who think that Genesis is to be read as history. And then you've got other people who say, there are timeless truths there, but they're done through figurative theological language. And he says it's obvious, of course, that Genesis is coming to us from a very different time and a very different culture. So we have to kind of interpret how they might have seen the information that's included there. Lennox then goes on and talks about the main views that Christians hold today. There's the 24-hour view, the day-age view, and something called framework. And that's the one that probably most of us are less familiar with. But let me run through these three as Lennox proposes or tells you about them. Of course, the 24-hour view, there were 7 24-hour days, creation day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. It was one earth week, somewhere 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. So they call that the young earth view. Then you have the day-age view, sometimes called old earth. And the days are in chronological order, but there are huge gaps of time between them, and they each represent a period of time of unspecified length. So you could end up with millions and millions and possibly billions of years. The one, though, that I wanted to, and by the way, I have some videos that I've done and some things that you can go to my website, apologeticsforlife.org, and you can read and listen to what I've said about this, because I try to talk about these views, and I show you some PowerPoints that you can take a look at. The one that's less familiar for people is called the framework view. Okay, so framework. It talks about logical order, but it's not really interested in chronological order. So the way they view it is days 1 to 3 form a triad, and that parallels days 4 to 6. So here's the example. Day 1, you get light. So that's giving form or structure to something that didn't have a form. All right, then day 4, right, there's the parallel, is the luminaries, like the sun and the moon. So day 1 was giving form or structure to something that wasn't there before, and then the second one is filling that form that's been created but it's empty. How about day 2? Well, what got formed were seas and skies. Day 5, it was filled with sea creatures and winged creatures. How about day 3? You got seas, you got dry land, you got vegetation. How did that get filled? That was day 6, land animals and humans. So it almost helps if you imagine a chart. You've got day 1, 2, 3 going down the side on the left. Up at the top, you say forming. Next to it on the right, you say filling. And then so you get day 1, day 2, day 3. You get under forming, you get light, sea and skies. Then you get sea, dry land, vegetation. How did they get filled? Go back up to where you had light. Go to the right. For day 1, plug in day 4, luminaries like the sun and the moon. For day 5, line that up with day 2. How did the skies and seas get filled? Winged creatures and sea creatures. Day 3, the seas, dry land, vegetation appear. How did they get filled? Through land animals and humans on day 6. So it's a parallelism, and it's striking. All right, so let's go on beyond that. So that just gives you some ideas here of what people have come up with. Another view that I have mentioned in a book, another podcast, is called Theistic Evolution, but I think I'll skip over that for now. I'm just doing what Lennox talks about here. He does have a appendix that talks about theistic evolution. Okay, so let's pick up with a word that we need to know, and that's day. How does it get interpreted in the beginning of Genesis? It's a Hebrew word, yom, and we first meet it in Genesis 1:5. Lennox says, God called the light day, and the darkness called night. Well, if you read it naturally, day is contrasted with night, so it's obviously not a 24-hour day. It's in the sense of daytime. That would be something like 12 hours. Then go to Genesis 1:5. The second time, it's again in Genesis 1:5. It's in the context of saying that day 1 involves evening and morning. Well, now day sounds like it's 24-hour days. So now we have two meanings for the word day just in the same verse. Now, go down to where the seventh day, the Sabbath, is mentioned. God rests from the work. There's no mention of evening or morning there like the other 6 days. And many authors have pointed that out and says we need an explanation for it. So the seventh day is definitely different than the first 6. And if you read some of the other verses in the Bible, we find out we're still today even in God's Sabbath rest. So this seventh day is obviously way longer than one 24-hour period. And so because it's this long period of time, then some people think that the other days could be similarly long too. If you go to Genesis 2:4, Lennox points out that in some translations it says this, when God created. Well, the word when in Hebrew is in the day God created. Now in the day, that's obviously not 24 hours. Lennox says, imagine an elderly man saying, in my day there were very few aircraft in the sky. So his day is a lengthier period of time, not just a day of the week. So Lennox is wrapping all this up to say that the word day has several distinct meanings just in the beginning 2 chapters of Genesis. And they're natural. Each one's literal, but it's odd, isn't it? So what are we to make of this? Well, let's go to the nature of the creation week itself. This is crucial. I think this is really interesting. Lennox says you've got the initial creation act, that's in the first 2 chapters of Genesis 1, is separated from the 6 days of creation that follow it. So, according to the text, day 1 begins in verse 3, not in verse 1. The verb created in Genesis 1:1 means an event that took place before the story gets underway. So the use of the narrative tense, he says, begins in verse 3. So what does all this imply? Well, Lennox says that beginning at Genesis 1:1 doesn't necessarily take place on day one, as is assumed by so many people. So, catch this. This means, at least here's a possible interpretation, that the age of the earth is a separate question from the interpretation of the days. He says that's often overlooked. So, what's his takeaway? That the text of Genesis 1:1, in separating the beginning from day one, leaves the age of the universe completely up in the air. It's indeterminate. So, he says you could actually believe in those creation days being 24-hour days, but the universe being ancient, because verse 1 is separate from those days. So we could have a huge gap between verse 1 and then the start of the creation. So that's fascinating. He says there's another possibility. The writer didn't intend for people to think of the first 6 days as a typical Earth week, but maybe a sequence of 6 creation days. So God creates, and then maybe a long period of time goes by, and then God creates, and then another long period of time goes by. So he says it's possible that these individual days might have been separated from one another by some extended period of time. At each stage, whenever that day happens, whether it's 24 hours or whether it's literally 24 hours or a chunk of time, at each stage, God is injecting some more information and energy. You can't get the evolution to bring this about. You need new information. So the 6 creation days could be spaced out over a long period of time, or they could be boom, boom, boom after each other. Now he says one consequence, if this is true, that God interjects and all of a sudden, boom, there's more information. He said, what do geologists tell us? Well, he says that's what they're finding. The fossil evidence suggests sudden appearance of new levels of complexity. And then there are periods where nothing seems to be happening. So anyway, let's pick up beyond that. Let's go to the problematic 4th day. Why is that a problem? He says, if there's a chronological dimension to the days, how is it that the sun was made on day 4? Does that mean the sun came into existence on day 4? Well, how do you understand earlier verses that talk about evenings and mornings? How can you have a day if there's no sun there? Well, he said some have postulated maybe there's some kind of non-solar light source for the first 3 days. He says, well, and what he's doing here is talking about Hugh Ross especially. I've read a lot of Hugh Ross's books. One suggestion is that on day 4, the sun, moon, and stars appear because the point of view is from the earth, from the surface of the earth. And on day 4, the sun, moon, and stars appear when that cloud cover that had been completely enveloping the earth, when that dissipated. So that's a possibility too. Anyway, this should give you just an idea of what's going on here with this chapter. He's got notes at the end. Let me share with you an interesting quotation from John Mark Reynolds, who's a young earther. He said, we can admit that as recent creationists, that's what he means, he's a young earth person, as recent creationists, we are defending a very natural biblical account at the cost of abandoning a very plausible scientific picture of an old cosmos. He says, but over the long term, this is not a tenable position. In our opinion, old earth creationism combines a less natural textual reading with a much more plausible scientific vision. And Reynolds says at the moment this would seem the more rational position to adopt. Isn't that interesting? So John Mark Reynolds is a young earth person, but he's saying actually the old earth position seems more rational. Now, there are a lot of reasons to reject the theistic evolution perspective. I've written about that, and we can talk about it in another podcast. But the young earth and the framework and the old earth positions are really interesting. Of course, Morris, the Morris family, they've written extensively on the young earth position, and Dwayne Gish has. And anyway, so you've got several people. Ken Ham is a young earth position. A good old earth position to take a look at sometime would be Hugh Ross. So Ken Ham has Answers in Genesis, and Hugh Ross has Reasons.org. So you might take a look at those, because I think they're both fascinating. We don't want to fight with each other. We're all opposed to evolution. We think you can't have this kind of creation happening without some kind of guidance going on there from outside. So anyway, just to give you an idea that Lennox has tackled something very interesting here, very accessible, easy to read, fascinating book. Again, it's called 7 Days That Divide the World. Well, thank you very much, and I hope you have a good rest of your day, and let's do another podcast soon.